Hi, and welcome to the Lernard.com section on Jenkins Extra Features. So far in this chapter, we've looked at the general purpose of Jenkins for automating the build and deployment of code, and then we've created a simple pipeline to demonstrate those features. Last section, we codified that pipeline using a Jenkins file that allowed us to version control the whole pipeline definition, but our example was simple. It had hard-coded paths, and it wasn't very feature-rich. So in this section, we're going to look to improve that pipeline by having a look at some of the excellent extra features of Jenkins files that you might find yourself using in industry. In some ways, this section and the last one could be made into a single section, as the diagram remains unchanged, but personally I find it too hard to concentrate on anything for more than about 30 minutes without my mind starting to wander, so I felt that separating this out into two sections was probably a good call. As we already know broadly what we're up to here, let's jump straight over to our Ubuntu VirtualBox VM, open up our Jenkins folder in Visual Studio Code, and get cracking adding some exciting new features to our pipeline. As this repo is going to be used for all the sections in this chapter, I want to make a quick backup of the sections for Jenkins file so that it's still available as a reference, but you don't have to do this if you don't want. Great, now that's done, let's open our proper Jenkins file here and start on some improvements. To illustrate the idea that Jenkins is building everything in the workspace path, last section we were using the complete path here in our code. But actually, Jenkins' current working directory is always its own workspace folder, so we can delete this whole path now we're familiar with it, and just leave the build folder, and it'll work just the same. I should mention at this point that some of you may have noticed that it isn't strictly necessary for me to define checkout SCM here either, as Jenkins will do that anyway without me explicitly writing this step. And yes, you're right. I could remove that step as it stands now without effect, but I've written it as a habit as it allows us to add more checkout options later, such as downloading submodules if we have them, and also is guaranteed to check out the specific commit from which the Jenkins file originated. In this simple case it's not really adding value, but later on we may find ourselves needing it, so I think I'll leave it in anyway just as a reminder. Right, the next thing that jumps out here is that we have lots of hard-coded stuff that should be variables. There's the username, the server IP, and the site name, all of which we'd rather abstract out, I reckon, and Jenkins provides several easy ways to do that. The first way is just to define standard variables. These are traditionally defined at the top of the file, right outside of the pipeline. I'm going to pop a quick comment here saying define variables, just to remind us of what these things are, and now I'm going to define our first variable. So we write def, and then a key value pair, and then we give the key a meaningful name, so server IP here, then an equal sign, then in quotes the value that we want it to have. So I'm going to put the IP of my AWS web server here. As you probably noticed, now we're this far through the Jenkins course, I'm assuming you've already gone and sorted out your web server, and you don't need me explicitly saying how to create it. But if you haven't made one yet and you want to, there's full instructions how to do so at the start of this chapter. Let's make a second variable here called username, and now I'm going to give that the value Ubuntu. Now, of course, we want to add the variables in this statement here in place of their hard-coded values. A really key point in Jenkins files, and one that I guarantee will cause you a headache every now and again, is the concept of single and double quotes having slightly different properties, similar to how they do in bash scripts. Single quotes will do literally whatever is put between them without any variable substitution. So for example, if I put a variable in there like $server IP, it will not substitute it for a value, it will literally just write $server IP. If I want the variables to actually work, I have to change these quotes here for double quotes, which are what is known as templatable, which basically means that variables will be properly substituted. There are other differences too, which mean you might want to use singles, but this is a big one and really worth remembering. And now let's add our variables. So $, open curly brackets, username, $, open curly brackets, server IP. There, that's looking better already. Before we dash over to Jenkins in a fit of excitement to test this new config, there's also another way variables are commonly defined in Jenkins that we can try, and that's by adding them as environment variables. These work exactly like environment variables in Linux, and can be defined at the pipeline level or stage level, and will just apply within that scope. To define environment variables, we open a block like this that says environment, and then simply add them as key value pairs within that block. Within their scope, they have all the same properties as normal environment variables. So for example, if I were to write path here, I would be modifying the actual path environment variable. Aside from that, we can use them pretty much in the same way if we want to. So as before, I can change this hard-coded site name to $, curly brackets, and then site name now, and it will read that variable from the environment. Great! Now we've got that nicely variabilized up using our two different types of variables. Let's check these improvements back into our repo. So, as usual, hop over to the terminal. A quick git status to see that we're happy and we've got the right changes. And now git add -a, git commit -m and a sensible message. So, added variables. Then git push origin master. To see this in action, let's open up Firefox and browse back to localhost 8080 to our Jenkins server. Now at this point, we could definitely just use the section 4 job, as it's looking for the same Jenkins file, so it'll just find the current one and build it. I'm going to create a new section 5 job, just so I've got historical record on screen of what we've been up to, but please don't feel any urge to do so if you don't want. You can just as easily use the same section 4 project for everything in this chapter. Anyway, I'm going to click New Item here. I'll give it the title Section 5. Choose Multi-Branch Pipeline as before, and then OK. Then I'm going to choose Add Source, and once more copy in the Lernard repo URL that I've got in my clipboard, and choose our pre-saved credentials here. Actually, just as a side note, all of the Lernard repos are public, so it doesn't really matter what credentials that I'm using. They don't require specific authentication to clone. This means that if you want to push back the boundaries of laziness, you could even just clone the Lernard repos directly and not actually make your own ones at all, just to test out Jenkins, and it would work fine. But I know that you are a person who values hard work and would never dishonour yourself in such a way, so I'll speak no more about it. I'll just save this here. And now we can see it's scanning for a Jenkins file and successfully finding one. It's immediately kicked off a build of master here, so let's jump straight into that and check all is well with our new variabilized setup. And yes, green and all the way through to the deployment, so we haven't broken anything by variabilizing. Aside from that, of course, nothing has changed, as variabilizing things doesn't actually alter the functionality. It's all just about neatness and usability. So let's go straight back to VS Code and learn some more nice features. The next thing we're going to add is a parameter block. Parameters are variables that are chosen at build time to perform particular functions, such as toggling something on or off, giving something a particular value, or changing something. They have a default value, which will be chosen if there's no user-selected value, and can otherwise take the form of a drop-down of options, perhaps a checkbox, or a string field that needs to be filled out. To demonstrate this here, we're going to use just one of the several different types you could select, that of drop-down menus of choices. But if you want to see the exact syntax for others, just Google Jenkins parameter. Once you've used one parameter, really you've used them all. They're all easy to understand, so you'll have no trouble applying this knowledge across the set. So, to get going with this, we're going to write parameters here, then as usual, open a pair of curly brackets. Inside the brackets, we're going to write choice, which is the type that provides a drop-down menu of options, and then open a pair of normal brackets. Then for this particular type, I need a name, which I'm going to call strict host, though I'm just choosing that myself here, I could have written anything. Then we write choices, open two square brackets for an array, and inside here we put our list of what we want in the drop-down. In our case, let's keep it nice and simple and just have a no and a yes. The order of these is important, as in a choices array, the first one is always the default. As you've probably guessed by its name, I'm going to use this parameter to define whether or not we should use strict host key checking for our SCP command. But I want the default to be no, so that has to go first. Finally, now we've created our options, I'm going to give this a description. All that remains now is to add this parameter in place of the hard-coded no we have at the moment, which I do in a very similar way to a variable, with a $, and then some curly brackets. But now, inside these brackets, I first write params to indicate this is a parameter, then a dot, and then the parameter name. OK, this looks like it should work, so let's push this back up to Git and give it a test drive. I'm actually going to fast forward the Git here now, and I will do for the rest of this chapter, as I'll wager the novelty of hearing me saying git push origin master is waning a little. But if you do want a refresher on Git commands, go and have a look at the Git section in the basics chapter. Excellent. So if we now switch back to Jenkins and run a build through, initially it's not going to do that much as the steps themselves will be the same, but it's going to force it to reread the pipeline. I could also have scanned the pipeline in the main window too, and either would work fine. Now that's done then, if we refresh our screen here, watch what happens to the Build Now button that we've been used to clicking on so far. Now it's changed to Build with Parameters, which shows that it's detected our parameters block and is allowing us to make modifications before the build runs. If we click that button then, sure enough we can see our strict host parameter here, with no and yes as the options and the appropriate description we gave it. We don't need to run another build through, as we've just seen that that all runs fine. At the moment, if I choose yes, it would fail on deployment anyway, because the server isn't currently set up with a known hosts file that would allow that to succeed, so let's leave it on the no default. Just the way we've implemented it, the parameters feature may not look particularly useful, but it's super useful, and you're bound to come across it loads in industry for such diverse purposes as releasing to different environments, different versions of a product, or toggling test suites on and off. This segues nicely into our next feature, as I'm sure some of you must be leaping up and down in your swivel chairs by now, yelling incoherently about the lack of tests in our build so far. And yes, well yelled, for without a doubt, all except the most inept of companies will have a comprehensive testing suite as part of their code, the automation of which will be one of your primary concerns as a DevOps engineer. I remember as if it were yesterday the exact moment I discovered I was expected to know this, having exaggerated my way into my first DevOps role, but was delighted to discover that more often than not, the whole role of the DevOps engineer in testing boils down to a single command, such as npm test, Gradle test, or mvm test. The developers themselves actually write the tests, and although most DevOps engineers will eventually end up knowing the testing of at least one programming language well enough to write tests on their own, the writing of the tests itself isn't usually an expected skill. Bearing in mind how important it is, you'll be pleased to hear that the fact it's been left out so far was deliberate, as I now want to bring it in to demonstrate the concept of parallel builds. A parallel build section is one where each stage within it builds at the same time, as you might imagine, instead of one after another. It's conceptually simple, and it's useful for anything that isn't relying on the previous stage that can be run together purely to save time. In our case, build will work whether or not the tests pass, so we can run build and tests as a parallel pair of stages simultaneously without worrying. Let's create a new stage below our build block here and name it Build and Test. Inside this block, we'll write the word parallel and use curly brackets to open another block. Now we're going to cut and paste the build stage into this here. Let's just neaten this up a bit. And then we're going to cut and paste it again to save time. We'll rename this second block to test, and then replace the command with npm test -- watch all equals false, which is just asking for the tests to be run and for no user input to be required. In our case, the tests were made automatically by the thing I used to make our website, and there is but a single test. We can see it here if we switch over to app.js.test, but you don't need to remember this. I'm just showing this for a bit of context and interest. The test is written in JavaScript, and it's just checking that the word section exists somewhere on our site as a demo test. If I do a search for the word section, we can see that indeed it does exist, so we'd expect this test to pass. Actually, I'll just change this to say section 5 here for neatness. Right, as before then, let's push these changes to master, and as I did last time, I'll just fast forward this a bit for the sake of your sanity. Okay, so back into Jenkins and our master build, and let's kick this off once more. And here we can see the build and test stage kicks off, and immediately build and test launch together. I actually find this particular view not very clear for whether something is parallel or not, but fear not, is in a later section of this chapter, we're going to look at something called Blue Ocean that will make everything way better looking and will make parallel stages stand out from the page a lot more. So for the moment, we can just assume it all went to plan and come back to it later. In fact, quickly, let's just have a look at the console for that build. And if I scroll down a bit, just for people who haven't seen this before, here's the results of the test, confirming that they all passed. Great! We're flying through the features here, and there's just a couple more left to round off this section. Jenkins is pretty full-featured, but unlike Ansible, I wouldn't say there's a huge galaxy of different options that you'll never feel like you've seen the end of. There is a vast community of plugins to choose from, but in my experience, the basic variation between pipelines seems to be a little bit smaller, and businesses I've worked with haven't really deviated that much from each other, or from what we're covering in this chapter. There's a great page you can find just by Googling the words Jenkins pipeline syntax and trying the first hit here, which covers in written detail everything we're going to go through in this section and more. It's the perfect quick reference. Aside from tests, another elephant in the room is the fact that so far we've been having to actually click the build button every time we want our build to kick off. This is a far cry from the glittering dream of full automation I promised, and not very practical in industry where there might be hundreds of projects all kicking off tens of times each a day. To improve on this then, we're going to add a polling trigger into our pipeline, which will dictate a fixed period of time that should elapse before Jenkins goes and automatically checks GitHub to see if there's been any changes to the code. If there hasn't, it will do nothing, but if it detects a change, then it will automatically kick off a build, which is definitely what we want. This is actually pretty easy to achieve with just a single line. Before our stages here in the pipeline, we can write the word triggers and, you guessed it, open a pair of curly brackets. Inside these we write poll SCM, followed by a pair of normal brackets, and then writing a cron statement for how often we want Jenkins to poll our source control manager, in this case Git of course. If you aren't familiar with cron, it's a method of specifying timing whereby the first field is minutes, the next hours, the next the day of the month, then weeks, then the day of the week. It's not a specific DevOps skill, so I won't go into it in detail here, but if you aren't familiar with it, just type cron, C-R-O-N, into a Google search and you'll find loads of great docs on it. Suffice to say for this example, it will poll Git once every 15 minutes. Those of you who are familiar with cron, you might be wondering why I have an H here rather than the more commonly seen star like so. The H stands for hash and is being used to randomize exactly when this will occur, so that if I reuse this for multiple jobs, they won't all kick off on the hour and at quarter past, etc., and overload the server. I would always recommend you do this. It's actually quite an important step, as server overload can be a big deal in Jenkins, and this is worth taking seriously. So that's it. Nice and brief, this one. Let's push this back up to the repo again and see if that works. So, once more, a quickly fast-forwarded push to master. And now, back into Jenkins, I'm going to kick off a rescan of the Jenkins file. And now it's picked that up. If we go back into master and click on View Configuration here, and click on the Build Triggers tab, a quick check under the Build Triggers confirms that Jenkins has picked up that setting. And in the message beneath the description box, it even declares when it thinks the next build will be as a result of this automated trigger. I think it's probably worth waiting to actually see this, so I'll jump back into the master branch here, and in fact let's also go into Visual Studio Code, and I'll alter this message on the main web page screen so that we know there's definitely a change for it to detect. Again, quick push to master. We've got 3 minutes until the next automated check of Git. Just enough time for me to sing you the whole of Honky Tonk Women by the Rolling Stones. But as you're a valued customer, I'll spare you that and instead pause the recording to make time jump forwards 3 minutes. There we go. So we should see this kick off shortly under its own theme. And there, we can see it's pending on the left there. And now it's kicked off. We haven't actually changed any build steps, so I'll just forward straight through all of this. There we go. And now we can confirm it's actually released the code we just pushed by browsing to our web server. and as we can see, it's got our triggered automatically message here, so it deployed the code successfully without us ever clicking build now. That trigger was easy to implement, but a really important concept, as we now have a situation where a developer merely pushing a piece of code to GitHub is enough to spark off a chain of events in our fully automated release process and deploy that code to either test or production as desired. There's one final feature to look at in this extras section before we're done, which is that of post sections in a pipeline. Post simply runs at the end of the pipeline after all the stages, and I've generally seen it used for things like notification systems, kicking off an email or perhaps a Slack message to let you know how the build went. Importantly, the post section can be configured to run whether or not the pipeline itself was successful if desired, which is very useful if you are using it for notifications. I've saved the easiest for last here really, as all we have to do to implement this is to write the word post, and in our case we're going to specify that it always run, so I'll write the word always here, followed by another pair of curly brackets, and now rather than implementing an entire messaging system just to demo this, I'm just going to dummy this by writing echo send an email to mimic the sort of thing we might want to do. So then, final run of the day. We'll just do one more fast-forwarded push to master. There we go. And now let's go and check this out in the GUI. And there, it will come as no surprise to see it's run our post step, and if we have a quick look at the logs here, you can see it's done our mock email message too. So that's it. We've covered a really great selection of sexy Jenkins extras there. We've made our pipeline trigger automatically, we've variabilized things in 2 different ways, added some testing, and experimented with a parallel build to save some time. And then finally, we created a post section to signify possibly emailing or Slack messaging someone at the end. Okay, I think that's enough extra features for Jenkins pipeline, but I'm really glad to have got that out of the way, as to me, the next section is going to be the most interesting one of the whole Jenkins chapter. Up until now, we've just used Jenkins for build and deploy related features, but in fact it can be used for so much more than that. I won't spoil the surprise now, but if you're too excited to wait any longer, then join me in the next section to find out what I'm going on about. Hopefully see you there.